Have you ever walked through a place where the air itself felt alive, as if every breath carried stories of hands, tools, and dreams, shaping something greater than anyone could fully understand? Tonight, I invite you to step softly into the Belfast of the early 1900s, a city wrapped in cool mist, and the ever-present scent of salt drifting in from the harbor. Close your eyes and allow your breathing to settle into an easy rhythm, as gentle as the tide washing against stone. Let the world around you grow quiet, until you can almost hear the distant echoes of hammers tapping against steel, sparks falling like tiny comets, and voices moving through the shipyard in calm determination. Before Titanic became a legend, she was a thought forming slowly in the minds of designers, draftsmen, and shipbuilders. And before that thought took shape, Belfast was already a city of craftsmen, a place where skill passed from one generation to the next like a torch glowing in the dim light of early dawn. Imagine walking along the docks as the morning fog lifts. The cobblestones are cool beneath your steps. The wooden crates stacked nearby smell faintly of rope and tar. And somewhere deeper in the shipyard, a whistle signals the beginning of another day of labor. Men pull on their gloves, adjust the caps on their heads, and exchange quiet greetings as they move toward the towering cranes and half-built frames that cast long shadows across the ground. The shipyard of Harland and Wolff stretches out before you like a living organism. Its vast sheds, enormous guntries, and blackened chimneys create a landscape where sound and silence weave together. The clang of metal striking metal rises in waves, followed by moments of near stillness when workers pause to assess a measurement, a rivet line, or the angle of a newly placed plate. Even from a distance, you can feel the pulse of this place is steady, resonant heartbeat created by thousands of hands working toward a shared purpose. The energy here is not loud or demanding. It hums beneath the surface, waiting patiently for you to notice. As you stand at the edge of the yard, the cool air brushing against your face carries the scent of coal smoke, warm metal, and the faint sweetness of sawdust drifting from the carpenters' workshops. Lanterns flicker inside the sheds, casting soft golden light across benches scattered with blueprints, tools, and scraps of steel. The workers inside are already deep in their craft. Some bend over drafting tables, drawing precise lines that will guide the placement of beams, floors, and decks. Others inspect freshly forged rivets still warm from the fire. Each person moves with a quiet confidence born from years of practice, their motions steady, unhurried, and deliberate. You can sense the pride woven into this place, a pride built not on grand speeches or lavish celebrations, but on the knowledge that something magnificent is taking shape, something that will carry the spirit of Belfast across the ocean. The workers do not rush. They know the rhythm of the shipyard as well as they know their own breath. Every clang, every spark, every whispered instruction contributes to the unfolding of a vessel, unlike any the world has ever seen. Now imagine following a narrow path between towering stacks of steel plates. Each plate is smooth and cold under your fingertips, textured by the faint marks of the machines that shaped it. These plates will one day form the hull of the Titanic, but for now they rest quietly, waiting for their place in the great structure. Overhead, the cranes move slowly, their massive arms creaking as they turn. Their motion is deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though the machines themselves understand the weight of what they carry. As you walk deeper into the yard, the sounds shift. You hear the rhythmic pounding of riveters working in teams, their hammers rising and falling in patterns that echo across the entire site. The vibrations move through the ground and into your feet, a reminder that this ship is not just being built, it is being breathed into existence. Somewhere nearby, a foreman murmurs instructions to his crew, guiding the placement of a new steel frame. There is patience in his voice, and a quiet authority that keeps the work moving forward. Though the ship is not yet visible, its presence fills the air like a growing tide. You can almost sense the outline of the future Titanic rising around you, imagined by hundreds of minds, long before a single piece of metal was set into place. This is the birthplace of the dream, a city where sparks fall like fireflies, where hands calloused by cold mornings and long shifts become the instruments through which an idea becomes reality. As we begin our journey through the making of the Titanic, let your mind rest gently within this world of early Belfast. Picture the harbor illuminated by dawn, the shipyard alive with movement, and the steady rhythm of work that carries through every day. Let yourself drift into the calm strength of these workers, whose patience and dedication shaped every beam, every plate, every rivet. If you'd like to share where, in time or in the world, you are listening from tonight, I would be honored to read it as part of this quiet voyage through history. And if you wish to return for future journeys, told softly and slowly, you are always welcome here. For now, breathe deeply, settle into the stillness of this moment, and allow the story to unfold as gently as the first sparks that once lit the Belfast morning. Our path begins in a city of workers and dreams, where the Titanic first took shape long before she met the sea. Belfast at the dawn of the 20th century was a place where the morning light arrived slowly, filtered through a soft blanket of mist and the steady drift of smoke rising from hundreds of chimneys. As the first hints of daylight touched the rooftops, the city seemed to exhale, stretching awake in a quiet, deliberate way. The streets were cool underfoot, still damp from the lingering night air, and the distant call of gulls circled above the harbor, blending with the faint murmur of water against stone. This was not a city rushing forward. It was a city that moved with the rhythm of its workers, its shipyards, and its long tradition of craftsmanship, a place where every sound, scent, and movement carried traces of the sea. If you wandered these early streets, you would feel the life of Belfast in its textures. The old brick buildings held the warmth of generations of families who had lived and worked within them. Narrow alleyways led to small workshops where tools hung on wooden walls, their handles smooth from years of use. The smell of coal fires beginning to burn mixed with a salty breeze drifting through the riverfront, creating an aroma that felt both familiar and grounding. People walked with purpose, but without haste, offering quiet nods as they passed one another, their boots echoing softly on the cobblestones. This was a city bound together not by grandeur, but by the shared rhythm of work that began before the sun was fully risen. As you continued toward Queen's Island, where the Harland and Wolf shipyard dominated the landscape, the stillness of dawn transformed into a calm but steady hum of activity. The shipyard did not shout. It breathed. Its chimneys released slow trails of smoke that curled into the sky. The massive gantries, silhouetted against the pale morning, stood like guardians over the workers who moved beneath them. Even from a distance, you could sense the presence of countless tasks already underway. The clatter of carts carrying steel plates, the low conversations exchanged between foremen, and the rhythmic footsteps of men heading toward the heart of the yard. Everything here seemed to follow a silent script passed down through decades of labor, known instinctively by those who worked within its boundaries. As the fog gradually lifted, the outlines of the shipyard buildings grew clearer. Their tall windows caught the first warm glow of the rising sun, and the metal frames inside reflected that light in soft flashes. The cranes, still cool from the night, waited patiently to begin their slow and graceful movements. The river beside the yard mirrored the changing colors of the sky, shifting from gray to a muted silver, carrying the reflections of boats tied along the docks. You could almost imagine the water whispering stories from distant ports, offering quiet encouragement to the shipbuilders preparing to shape the next great vessel. One of the most striking things about Belfast at this time was how naturally the city's life blended with the work of its shipyard. Families woke to the same sounds. The whistle signaling the start of the day, the clanging of steel, the deep thud of machinery beginning to turn. From the windows of small houses, mothers watched their husbands and sons make their way toward the yard, their silhouettes softened by the morning haze. Children, still rubbing sleep from their eyes, learned to identify the different sounds by their rhythms, as if each were a verse in the long song of the city. Even those who did not work in the shipyard felt its presence as part of their daily life, a constant reminder that their city was building something extraordinary. Closer to the gates of Harland and Wolf, the energy of the morning grew stronger. Workers gathered in small groups, adjusting the straps of their overalls, checking the tools they carried in canvas bags, or sharing a few last words before stepping into the world of steel and sparks. Their faces carried the calm focus of people who knew their craft well, tempered by years of experience. Some were young men just beginning their lives in the yard, while others had decades of labor behind them, each line on their face a quiet testament to the work they had given to the city. They entered the yard not as individuals, but as part of something larger, a collective pulse that moved the machines, lifted the steel, and shaped the future. Once inside the shipyard, the atmosphere changed subtly. The air felt different, almost heavier with the warmth of metal and the faint temps of oil. The ground beneath your feet vibrated with distant machines waking up. Sunlight filtered through the high windows of the sheds, illuminating drifting particles of dust that moved like slow, golden snow. Workbenches were already covered with tools arranged in careful rows. Hammers, gauges, measuring tapes, and pencils sharpened fine points. It was a place of organization and purpose, but also of quiet beauty, where the glow of morning light touched the rough surfaces of wood and steel in gentle patterns. In these early hours, Belfast felt like a city suspended between rest and motion, caught in the quiet space where dreams begin to take form. Before a single rivet was driven into the hull of the Titanic, before her name was known, the city itself held the promise of what she would become. The workers who stepped into the shipyard carried not only their tools, but the traditions of their families, the pride of their community, and the unspoken understanding that their efforts would ripple far beyond the borders of their home. Belfast was more than the place where the Titanic was built. It was the cradle of her creation, a city whose smoke, salt, air, and quiet determination shaped the vessel long before she touched the sea. When you breathe in the air of this moment, cool, textured, rich with the scent of work beginning, you can almost feel the first stirrings of the Titanic herself, waiting patiently for the hands that would bring her to life. Here, in this city wrapped in smoke and salt air, her story truly began. Before the Titanic existed in steel and rivets, she lived quietly in the minds of those who imagined her. In Belfast, where the shipyard rose like a cathedral of industry, there were moments when conversations carried a hint of something new, an idea so vast that it seemed to shimmer at the edges of thought. These whispers did not come with fanfare. Instead, they emerged in the soft murmur of designers leaning over drafting tables, in the low voices exchanged in dim offices overlooking the yard, and in the quiet pauses shared by workers who sensed that the company was preparing to undertake something far greater than the ships they had built before. Imagine stepping into one of the design rooms in the earliest days of this vision. The air inside is warmer than the chill outside, carrying the scent of ink, paper, and polished wood. Lamps cast gentle pools of golden light across long tables where blueprints rest, still empty, waiting for lines that will one day echo across the ocean. The room is peaceful, a refuge where thoughts can stretch and settle. Men stand near the windows, looking out at the shipyard below, their silhouettes softened by the morning glow. They speak in calm tones about balance, strength, and the possibility of building a vessel that would not merely cross the Atlantic, but redefine what a journey could feel like. These early discussions flowed like the first strokes of a brush across a blank canvas. Some questioned the feasibility of such an undertaking, while others felt a quiet thrill at the challenge ahead. Even the skeptics leaned closer, drawn by the magnetism of the idea. The notion of creating a ship larger, stronger, and more graceful than any before it stirred something deep within the hearts of those present. Though the Titanic did not yet have a name, there was already a sense and almost instinctive understanding that she would be a vessel carrying not just passengers, but the essence of Belfast's ambition. Outside these offices, the workers of the shipyard felt the energy shift in subtle ways. They noticed how the managers walked, with slightly longer strides, how foremen paused in conversation, as if weighing the weight of what was to come, and how draftsmen lingered at their desks long after the lamps should have been dimmed. Rumors began to circulate, quietly. Some said the new ship would be the largest ever built. Others claimed she would combine strength with elegance in ways the world had never seen. For many workers, these whispers brought a sense of anticipation, on unspoken promise that their skills would soon be tested in ways that honored their craft. In the evenings, after the shipyard gates had closed and the echoes of hammering faded into the quiet of the city, pubs and small gathering spots across Belfast came alive with soft conversations. Workers sat at wooden tables, nursing cups of tea or pints of ale, sharing thoughts and voices worn from long days. They wondered what materials would be needed, how the new cranes would handle the weight, and how many hands would be required to lift this dream into reality. These moments were not filled with tension or urgency. Instead, they carried a steady, humble excitement, as if the city itself sensed that something remarkable was rising on the horizon. Even the river seemed to take notice. The lagoon flowed past the shipyard with a slow, quiet grace, reflecting the lights along the docks in ripples of gold and silver. Those who worked near the water often paused during their tasks to watch the reflections shift and shimmer. In the gentle movement of the river, many found a sense of command, understanding that all great creations begin with stillness before they gather form. The water carried ships each day, but now, without any words, it seemed to await one that would change its story forever. Behind the scenes, the vision continued to grow. Draftsmen sharpened their pencils and began sketching preliminary shapes that suggested the curve of a hull, the sweep of a deck, and the emerging silhouette of a ship destined to command the ocean. Engineers reviewed calculations with quiet concentration, tracing their fingers along the lines they had drawn, imagining the enormous beams that would one day rise into the sky. Every small decision, every gentle stroke of ink on paper, brought the ship a little closer to life. Though nothing had yet been built, the soul of the Titanic was already forming. It lived in the hearts of those who dreamed her into existence, in the hands that prepared the tools, and in the city that breathed strength and determination into every one of its creations. There was a softness to this early phase, a sense of wonder that wrapped itself around the thought of building something so immense that it would leave an imprint on history. As night fell over Belfast and lamps were extinguished one by one across the shipyard, the dream remained awake. It lingered in the quiet rooms where blueprints rested, and the memories of conversations shared throughout the day, and in the steady pulse of a city preparing itself for what lay ahead. The Titanic, still only a whisper, moved gently through the thoughts of all who would soon bring her into being. And in this period of anticipation, Belfast held its breath, unaware that the voices murmuring in dimly lit rooms were giving birth to one of the most unforgettable creations the world would ever know. Before steel was lifted, before sparks illuminated the shipyard, and long before the hull began to rise into the Belfast sky, the Titanic existed only as a constellation of lines on paper, lines drawn slowly, deliberately by hands that understood the weight of what they were shaping. This phase of creation was quiet. It unfolded not in the noisy heart of the shipyard, but in rooms filled with lamplight, dust motes drifting in the air, and long tables where papers lay smooth and untouched in the early morning stillness. Imagine stepping into such a room as the first drafts of the ship began to take form. The air is warm, carrying the faint scent of ink and polished wood. Outside, the shipyard hums softly, a distant presence through the thick walls. But inside this room, the world feels suspended, controlled, centered completely on the precision of thought and pencil. Lamps rest on tall stands, their soft glow illuminating sheets of blank paper that stretch across the table like the surface of a still sea. Engineers and draftsmen gather, not in hurried clusters, but in thoughtful, measured silence. They know that what is drawn here will guide every hammer, rivet, and weld for years to come. One man positions a ruler gently against the page. His hand moves with the steadiness of someone who has spent a lifetime translating ideas into lines. Another adjusts a compass, the metal glinting faintly in the lamplight. The room fills with the delicate sound of pencil graphite scratching across paper, a sound so soft that it almost becomes part of the breath of the space itself. With each movement, the earliest outline of the Titanic awakens, first as curves, tenus angulis, then as a shape that begins to resemble the great ship she will become. These first lines are not rushed. They emerge in long, unbroken gestures, as if guided by an invisible current. Draftsmen pause often, lifting their pencils to study what they have drawn, tilting their heads slightly as they imagine how steel plates will follow the arc they have sketched. The ship must be strong. She must be graceful. She must carry lives across an unpredictable ocean with comfort and confidence. These thoughts settle into the room like whispers, guiding the careful hands that draw her into being. On a nearby table rolled blueprints of earlier ships, the stocked a reminder of knowledge earned through years of challenges and triumphs. Engineers unroll some of these documents, comparing notes, evolving ideas, and refining concepts that will give the Titanic her identity. The hum of thought seems almost tangible. Every person in the room works not only with technical skill, but with a quiet sense of responsibility. They understand that what they create here will become the framework for thousands of workers who will translate these drawings into a ship anchored in reality. As the hours pass, the room slowly fills with new versions of the ship. Slight adjustments alter the shape of the bow, the curve of the stern, the placement of beams and decks. These changes are subtle but profound, each one influencing how the Titanic will stand against the sea. The draftsmen work in a slow cadence, taking breaks only to stretch their fingers, sip warm tea, or step outside for a moment of fresh air before returning to the lines that wait for them. There is no sense of urgency, only dedication, patience, and the deep satisfaction of watching an idea become clearer with each stroke of the pencil. If you look closely, you can see how the ship's personality begins to appear. Her hull, long and sleek, her decks drawn with an elegance that suggests movement even before she exists. The curve of her keel reveals strength, while the wide breadth of her frame hints at the confidence she will carry across the Atlantic. It is here, in these rooms filled with quiet and concentration, that the Titanic receives her first breath, not a breath of wind or sea, but a breath of intention. Outside the windows, the sky shifts gradually from pale morning to muted afternoon. The light changes, casting new angles across the tables, revealing the texture of the paper and the faint traces of erased lines. Draftsmen lean closer as shadows lengthen, studying every detail with fresh eyes. What they craft must be perfect in its proportions, flawless in its structure. The shipyard waits for these drawings, unable to begin without them. A single miscalculation here could echo through every phase of construction, so each decision is made with a sense of reverence. Sometimes, in the late hours, when the rest of the city has quieted and the shipyard's noises have faded, one or two engineers remain. They sit in the warm glow of the lamps, reviewing the day's work with gentle persistence. Their fingers trace the outlines lightly, as though feeling the future hold beneath their touch. In these silent moments, the Titanic seems almost present still, only a collection of lines, but lines infused with purpose, expectation, and the dreams of a city ready to bring her to life. By the time the first full blueprint is completed, it is more than a drawing. It is a promise that soon the quiet lines on paper will transform into steel plates rising against the sky, into rivets driven home with rhythmic certainty, into decks that will one day echo with footsteps and laughter. These early drawings hold the essence of everything the Titanic will become: her size, her strength, her elegance, and her destiny. And so, with the careful drawing of these first lines, the grand dream begins to move from imagination into reality. The shipyard outside may not yet show any signs of change, but within these rooms, the future is already unfolding, quietly, steadily, with the soft sound of pencil against paper and the unwavering focus of those who believe in what they are creating. The morning the shipyard first stirred for the Titanic-esque creation was not marked by any ceremony or announcement. Instead, it began the way most days at Harland and Wolff begun, with a slow rising of light over Queen S Island and a soft hum building beneath the surface of the still air. But for those who stepped through the gates that day, there was something different in the way the yard breathed. The blueprints that had taken shape in warm rooms filled with lamplight had finally reached the hands of foremen, planners, and craftsmen. And as the workers arrived, one by one, the shipyard seemed to lean forward in anticipation, as if awakening to the promise of something extraordinary. Before the heavy work began, the yard felt almost like a vast, sleeping giant. The great gantries, their steel frames towering above everything else, stood motionless against the pale morning sky. Their arms cast long shadows across the ground, stretching across stacks of lumber, piles of steel plates, and rows of tools awaiting the touch of human hands. Dew clung to the rails and scaffolding, turning each surface into a mirror that reflected the soft colors of the sunrise. The river flowed beside the yard with a slow, steady rhythm, its surface still and glassy, carrying the reflection of the massive structures preparing to come alive. As the first workers entered, their footsteps created the initial spark of motion. They moved with calm purpose, adjusting their gloves, tightening their coats against the lingering chill, and exchanging quiet greetings. The shipyard responded in subtle ways. A crane creaked as though stretching after a long rest. A distant machine coughed to life, sending a faint vibration through the ground. The metallic scent of oil began to rise as valves were turned and gears coaxed into motion. This awakening was not loud or chaotic. It was patient, almost gentle, as if the yard understood the importance of beginning deliberately. Foremen gathered around the newly delivered drawings, spreading the large sheets across makeshift tables fashioned from wooden planks and metal supports. They traced fingers along the lines that defined the Titanic's frame, discussing drop angles, measurements, and the sequence of assembly. Their voices blended with the natural sounds of the yard clatter of tools being sorted, the low murmur of workers preparing their stations, and the distant whistle of a train bringing fresh loads of material. In these early moments, long before the first rivet was driven, the shipyard felt like a vast instrument being tuned. When the work officially began, it did so with a shift in atmosphere. The quiet hum deepened into something steadier, more grounded. Sparks began to appear in short bursts, flickering beneath the hands of men cutting initial pieces of steel. The cranes awakened fully, moving in slow, deliberate arcs as they lifted heavy beams from the ground and swung them toward their first positions. Their movement was graceful in its own way, massive machines, turning with the precision of dancers, guided by experienced operators who understood their weight and temperament. The sound of hammers striking metal soon followed, echoing across the entire yard with a rhythmic consistency. This sound, familiar to the workers of Belfast, now held a new resonance. Each strike was part of the first beats of the Titanic's heartbeat, a pulse that would grow stronger with every piece put into place. The ground vibrated gently with each impact, carrying the energy of creation through the soles of boots and into the very structure of the yard itself. It was a reminder that building a ship was not simply a mechanical process, it was a living collaboration between human skill and raw material. The workers moved with focus, their actions shaped by years of experience. Some operated massive saws that sliced through steel with a shower of bright orange sparks. Others slid enormous plates along greased supports, guiding them into the positions marked in the blueprints. Teams of riveters formed small units of perfected coordination, each group moving as a single entity, one man heating the rivets until they glowed red, another inserting them into pre-drilled holes, while others hammered them into place with a tempo that echoed across the yard like a quiet storm. Above all this, the cranes continued their slow, majestic dance. Their cables hummed as they lifted beams that would become part of the Titanic's skeletal frame. Sunlight glinted off the steel as it rose, catching the eyes of workers below who paused for a breath to watch the pieces ascend. These beams were more than metal. They were the bones of the ship, taking shape. The first signs that the dream traced in pencil lines was becoming part of the physical world. Throughout the day, the shipyard seemed to grow more alive. The sounds intensified, not in chaos, but in harmony. Sparks cascaded like falling stars from workstations where steel met flame. The scent of hot metal mingled with the ever-present smell of the sea, creating an aroma that felt both harsh and strangely comforting. Workers communicated with simple gestures, nods, raised hands, small motions of reassurance and coordination. The yard was loud, yet it held a steady sense of order, shaped by the collective understanding of those who knew its rhythms well. In quiet moments between tasks, workers would step aside to observe from a distance. They watched as the first outlines of the Titanic's frame began to rise, still small but unmistakably present. The sight carried a weight that was difficult to put into words. It was pride, anticipation, and the subtle awareness that they were participating in something that would outlive them all. For many, this early stage held a particular beauty, the kind that comes not from finished grandeur, but from the tender beginnings of an immense creation. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long beams of amber light across the yard, the first section of Titanic's skeleton stood upright, anchored firmly to the blocks below. It was only a fragment, a mere suggestion of the ship she would become, but in that moment, it felt monumental. The workers gathered their tools, their bodies tired but their spirits buoyed by the sight. The shipyard, once sleepy and still, now pulsed with the energy of beginnings. And as the evening light softened to dusk, the Titanic's presence, new, fragile, and full of promise, stood quietly amid the towering gantries. The city around her continued its rhythm, unaware of just how much this emerging structure would one day mean to the world. But within the shipyard, every worker felt a silent truth settling into the cooling air. The dream was no longer a whisper. It had begun to take shape. As the Titanic's frame continued to rise, day by day and week by week, the shipyard settled into a new rhythm, one defined not only by progress, but also by the quiet struggles that accompanied every great act of creation. These struggles did not make themselves known through grand gestures or loud complaints. They lived in the small, nearly invisible moments that unfolded behind the sheets of steel, beneath the scaffolding, and within the hearts of the men who labored from dawn until the fading light of evening. With each new piece placed into position, the work grew more demanding. The plates became heavier, the beams larger, the distances between workstations longer. The workers felt this shift in ways that were subtle but constant. A riveter might find his arms aching a little sooner than usual. A carpenter might need to pause for a breath halfway up a ladder, where he once climbed without thinking. The steel itself seemed to test them, challenging their endurance, with every heated rivet and every carefully lifted plate. Yet the workers continued, their motions steady, their focus unwavering, as though drawn forward by the steady pull of the ship taking shape before them. The weather often played its own part in these quiet challenges. Belfast's skies, known for shifting moods, brought sudden bouts of rain that left the scaffolding slick and the air heavy with the scent of damp metal. Workers pulled their coats tighter, adjusting their footing with a practiced caution. The cold seeped into gloves and boots, turning hands stiff and breath into visible clouds. But even on these gray, wet mornings, the men persisted. They moved with the slow determination of those accustomed to working with the elements rather than against them, understanding that the ship would not wait for perfect conditions. Inside the workshops, different kinds of struggles unfolded. Draftsmen received updated measurements that required small adjustments to their carefully drawn plans. These changes were never large enough to disrupt the entire design, but they required patience and precision. In rooms filled with the soft scratching of pencils, occasionaille, a miscalculation was discovered. A line that needed smoothing, a curve that needed refining. None of this caused frustration. Instead, it was met with thoughtful correction, another step in the long, deliberate path toward perfection. Onte, ground crew chiefs faced their own challenges. Coordinating hundreds of workers across different sections of the ship required more than authority. It required intuition. They read the atmosphere of the yard the way sailors read the wind. They sensed when a team needed a moment to regroup, or when a task could unfold more smoothly if approached from another angle. Their skill lay not only in understanding steel, but in understanding people how to keep them moving forward without pushing them beyond their quiet limits. There were also moments of strain that came from the sheer scale of the Titanic. Her growing form cast larger shadows each day, rising step by step into a presence that demanded attention. She towered above the men who worked beneath her, her beams stretching outward in a web of scaffolding. As the structure expanded, getting from one side of the yard to the other required longer walks, more careful navigation around the maze of supports. Workers adapted without complaint, adjusting their routines to accommodate the ship's growing body, aware that their labor was steadily giving her shape. Though these challenges were ever present, they were softened by the camaraderie that thrived within the yard. Shared glances between workers became unspoken conversations. A lifted chin from a foreman meant, "You're doing well." A steady hand offered to help lift a heavy tool carried more reassurance than words. During brief breaks, men leaned against warm steel plates, sipping from tin cups, and chatting quietly about their families, the state of the weather, or the progress of the ship. These small moments of connection brought warmth to the coldest days, grounding them in the simple truth that they were not alone in their efforts. As the ship grew taller, the interior spaces of her unfinished hull became a world of their own. Workers navigated narrow passages framed by beams, their footsteps echoing softly against the steel surrounding them. Inside these half-formed corridors, the air held a distinct smell, a mixture of metal dust, oil, and the faint sweetness of fresh-cut timber. The dim light filtering through gaps in the hull created patterns on the floor, shifting gently as crane arms passed overhead. In these quiet interior spaces, the challenges of the work felt more intimate, more personal. A misaligned beam might require hours of adjustment. A single rivet might need to be reheated and hammered again. Yet there was a quiet satisfaction in solving each small problem, in knowing that every correction brought the Titanic one step closer to life. At times, the struggles took the form of simple exhaustion. After long days, workers left the yard with tired shoulders and heavy footsteps, the rhythm of their walk matching the slow throb of their muscles. But even then there was a certain peace, and the fatiga-kind-of stillness that wrapped around them on their way home. They carried with them not only the physical weight of the day, but the knowledge that each challenge endured had helped shape something remarkable. As evening settled over Belfast, the yard gradually fell back into its quiet state. The last echoes of hammering faded into the distance. Sparks dimmed until there were no more. The cranes stilled, their silhouettes turning dark against the deepening sky. And in the quiet that followed, the growing form of the Titanic stood in silent testimony to the countless small struggles that had carried her forward. She rose higher than she had the day before, her lines sharper, the structure more defined, every inch of her shaped by effort that had unfolded not in triumph or noise, but in the calm perseverance of ordinary men. These struggles, soft, steady, almost invisible, were the heartbeat behind the steel. They would continue as the shipyard moved into the next phase of construction, shaping not only the Titanic, but the story of the city that built her. There are moments in the life of a great creation when something subtle shifts, moments that do not announce themselves loudly, yet linger in memory as turning points. In the long process of building the Titanic, one such moment arrived on a cool evening when most of Belfast was settling into the gentle quiet of night, unaware that within the shipyard, an awakening was quietly unfolding. Throughout the day, workers had been navigating a particularly demanding task, aligning a massive steel beam that would serve as one of the primary supports for the ship's midsection. The beam was heavier than most they had handled before, not simply in weight but in importance. It required precision so exact that even the smallest deviation would echo through the structure of the ship as she continued to grow. Many hands had guided it, many eyes had studied it, and yet by the time the sun dipped behind the distant rooftops, the beam still refused to settle perfectly into place. Instead of stopping, a small group of workers stayed behind, their tools still warm from a long day's effort. The yard, usually vibrant with sound, now felt like a vast, breathing silence, broken only by the occasional hum of cooling machinery. The towering gantries cast long shadows that blended with the deepening blue of the sky. Lanterns flickered along the scaffolding, their warm light illuminating patches of steel with a soft amber glow. The world outside seemed far away, as though wrapped in a quiet veil that allowed only this moment to exist. The workers gathered around the stubborn beam, their breath forming pale clouds in the cooling air. They spoke in low tones, exchanging ideas, recalculating measurements, and gently testing the alignment once more. There was no frustration in their voices, only calm determination, shaped by years of understanding the temperament of steel. Working beneath the lantern light gave the scene an almost meditative quality. Sparks rose and fell like fireflies as tools met metal, glowing briefly before dissolving into the dark. Gradually, the beam began to respond. With each careful adjustment, it shifted a fraction of an inch, settling more closely into the space designed for it. The workers paused often, wiping their hands on their coats, listening to the faint creaks and sighs of the ship's growing frame. It felt as though the Titanic herself was acknowledging their effort, guiding them gently toward the solution. At one point, a gust of wind brushed through the yard, stirring the lantern flames and sending a cascade of sparks drifting upward from a nearby welding station where one last torch remained lit. The sparks floated in graceful arcs, suspended briefly in the air before fading. In that moment, the yard seemed filled with a quiet magic, the kind that appears only when human effort and the stillness of night meet in perfect balance. Finally, after hours of steady work, the beam slid into its proper place with a soft, resonant sound. It was not dramatic. It did not echo loudly or call attention to itself. It was a gentle, unmistakable settling the sound of alignment, of structure recognizing structure, of a piece finding its home. The workers exchanged tired smiles, each aware that something important had just happened. This beam would support not only steel, but stories, footsteps, and the lives of countless passengers who would one day cross the Atlantic. They stood back to look at their work. The lanterns cast warm light across the freshly aligned steel, making it shimmer softly against the dark. For a moment, the entire shipyard felt still, as though sharing in their quiet triumph. The city beyond the yard continued its nightly rhythm, families settling into homes, lights dimming in windows, distant carriages passing along cobblestone streets, but Here inside the shipyard, time seemed to pause. In these poses, each man felt the significance of the moment. The Titanic was no longer simply rising. She was becoming. Each new piece set into place deepened her presence, made her more real, more whole. The shipyard had shifted from the early pulse of creation into the steady beat of progress. And this night marked the turn from dreams, traced on paper, to steel, finding perfect alignment. Before leaving, the workers extinguished the lanterns one by one. The yard faded back into darkness, leaving only the silhouette of the ship's growing form outlined against the sky. As they walked toward the gates, their footsteps echoed softly on the ground, carrying the rhythm of quiet pride. In the days to come, this moment would blend into the memory of the work, indistinct yet unforgettable, an evening when the sparks shone just a little brighter, when the shipyard held its breath, and when the Titanic, in her unfinished stillness, took another gentle step toward becoming the vessel that would one day capture the imagination of the entire world. As the months passed and the Titanic continued to grow, the shipyard entered a phase where the work carried a different weight not only of steel and machinery, but of the quiet toll such a vast project takes on the people who give themselves to it. The challenges of the early days had settled into a steady rhythm, yet beneath that rhythm lived moments of loss, moments of quiet revelation, and moments of subtle light that touched the workers in ways that would remain with them long after the ship left Belfast. There were days when the shipyard felt heavier than usual. The air seemed thicker with coal dust, the echoes of hammering sharper, the steps between scaffolding slower. These were not signs of weakness, but of the simple truth that the human body and spirit have limits, even in a city built on endurance. Men arrived to the yard, tired from sleepless nights or from worries carried silently on their shoulders. Some had families waiting at home, others had loved ones living far from Belfast, and still others dealt with aches that had become familiar companions. Yet every morning, they found a way to step into the yard, lace their boots, and face the work before them. Inside the rising structure of the Titanic, where steel beams formed intricate lattice of shadow and light, these quiet struggles often went unseen. A carpenter sanding a section of wooden framing might pause for just a moment, resting his hands against the smooth grain while he gathered his breath. A riveter might roll his shoulders to ease the tension left from the previous day's effort. A foreman might linger at the top of a staircase, scanning the progress of the ship not to check the work alone, but to remind himself of why the long hours mattered. These small acts of pause, nearly invisible, were part of the fabric of the ship's creation, just as much as the steel plates and rivets. There were losses too, not dramatic, but human. A worker might leave the yard for a few days to attend to an illness in the family. Another might suffer an injury requiring care and rest. These absences were felt deeply by those who worked beside them. The shipyard, for all its scale, was a place built on relationships. Each worker was part of a team, each team part of a larger whole. And when someone stepped away, their absence created a quiet space that others naturally filled with concern and support. It was in these moments that the true strength of the yard revealed itself, not in its machines or its cranes, but in the steadfast kindness shared between the people who gave it life. Yet for every struggle, there were lessons. Some were practical. How to adapt a technique to fit the ship's growing complexity, how to coordinate more fluidly between teams, how to work with new materials or evolving plans. Others were more subtle, learned not through instruction, but through experience. Workers discovered the patience required to approach each task with precision, understanding that rushing would only create challenges later. They learned the value of communication, of a quiet word, offered at the right moment, of a gesture that conveyed reassurance, of a simple nod that meant agreement and trust. And amidst these lessons, there were moments of light that surfaced in unexpected places. A warm beam of afternoon sun might slip through a narrow gap in the steel, illuminating dust in the air like floating sparks. A sudden break in the clouds might cast a soft glow over the scaffolding, giving the unfinished ship a gentle, golden outline. Workers sometimes paused in these moments, feeling the warmth settle briefly on their skin before returning to their tools. Light became a companion, arriving at times when the work felt long or the air felt cold, offering a quiet reminder that beauty lived even in the hardest environments. There was also light found in camaraderie, laughter shared between men during a short break, when someone recalled a memory from home or retold a familiar story. Warm cups of tea passed between hands, just beginning to feel the chill of an approaching winter. The soft hum of conversation at midday, drifting through the corridors of the unfinished hull where workers ate in small groups, leaning against steel beams while their voices echoed gently in the enclosed space. These simple moments carried a brightness that softened the edges of the day. For some, the work on the Titanic became a form of reflection as they shaped the ship's form. They found themselves thinking about their own lives, their families, their futures, their hopes. The slow, repetitive motions of labor created space for thought, and many discovered unexpected clarity in the steady rhythm of their craft. There was something grounding, almost meditative, in the consistency of the tasks, something that allowed the mind to wander just enough to find perspective. By the time the ship's interior spaces began to take form, the workers could see how their efforts, struggles, and lessons had built something remarkable. They walked through areas that once existed only as pencil lines on paper cord. Stairwells, dining rooms. Kavanzan felt the quiet weight of what they had accomplished. Each new section held traces of the hands that had shaped it, the energy of those who had learned, adapted, endured, and grown alongside the rising ship. As dusk fell over the yard each evening, the Titanic's silhouette stretched further into the sky, its curves more defined, its presence undeniable. The workers walked home with tired bodies, but steady hearts, carrying with them the lessons of the day lessons, born from effort, patience, and the simple courage of continuing. And in the cool quiet of the shipyard after they left, the unfinished Titanic stood in silence, holding within her steel bones the stories of every loss, every lesson, and every flicker of light that had carried her another step toward becoming whole. As the weeks drifted into months, the shipyard transformed around the growing silhouette of the Titanic. What had once been an array of scattered materials, tools, scaffolding, and workers moving between stations gradually became the world that orbited a single, immense presence. The ship no longer felt like a project or a blueprint brought to life. She felt like a being awakening slowly, deliberate as her massive form began to claim space in the Belfast sky. The workers saw it first in small ways, a shadow stretching farther than before, a curve becoming more defined, a deck reaching out where none existed just days earlier. A yacht morning, as the workers stepped through the gates of Harland and Wolff, they were met with a sight that subtly changed with every sunrise. The gantries, once towering over an empty keel, now framed a vast structure of steel that rose with a sense of quiet determination. The ship's bow, long and sweeping, began to reveal the graceful arc that would one day cut through the Atlantic waters. The stern expanded into a broad, commanding shape. Ribs of steel arched upward like the bones of a creature in the process of becoming whole. The shipyard felt different because of it. There was a new gravity in the air, a silent pull toward the towering frame that invited every eye, every thought. Workers who had spent years shaping ships still found themselves pausing, watching as the Titanic grew beyond anything they had built before. It was not pride alone that made them pause. It was wonder-soaked, steady wonder that settled deep inside, the kind that comes from witnessing something far larger than oneself slowly emerging into the world. Inside the hull, the atmosphere carried its own character. The interior of the unfinished ship was a maze of beams, ladders, and platforms illuminated by the warm glow of handheld lamps and lanterns hanging from hooks. The steel walls echoed the smallest sounds: footsteps, quiet voices, the clink of tools layering them into a gentle chorus that filled the hollow spaces. Light filtered in through narrow gaps where plates were not yet fitted, creating patterns on the floor that shifted with the movement of workers passing overhead. These interior spaces, though incomplete, had begun to feel like rooms that held secrets of what they would one day become. A corridor framed by half-finished beams whispered hints of future footsteps. A wide-open space in the center of the ship suggested the grandeur of dining rooms and lounges yet to be installed. Even the skeleton of the grand staircase, nothing more than beams and supports at this stage, held an aura of elegance that could be sensed before it was seen. Workers would pause here, sometimes just to imagine how light would fall in this space once the wood, glass, and carvings found their way into place. Outside, across the higher decks, the view was unlike anything most workers had ever experienced. Those assigned to the upper levels climbed long ladders or scaffolding that swayed slightly in the wind, bringing them to heights where Belfast stretched out below in soft layers of color and movement. From here, the city looked small, almost fragile compared to the immense structure under their hands. The Lagan River shimmered nearby, reflecting the sky in shifting silver tones. Their rooftops, the chimneys, the distant hills all appeared muted, soft by the height and the constant presence of the sea breeze. On clear days, standing atop the growing Titanic felt like standing between heaven and earth. The wind wrapped around the workers gently, carrying the scent of the river, the yard, and the faint aroma of coal smoke drifting from nearby factories. Tools clinked softly against metal railings. Voices floated upward, thin but clear, carried from somewhere far below. The entire ship felt alive with motion, even when everyone paused to appreciate the view. With the ship now rising into its full height and width, coordination became more intricate. Workers moved like currents through different sections of the yard, riveters in one area, carpenters in another, pipe fitters spread along various decks, electricians threading early wiring through narrow passageways. Each team operated in rhythm, trusting the others, feeling the pulse of the collective effort. The shipyard had become a living organism, and the Titanic its growing heart. What surprised many during this phase was how the ship seemed to change, not only in size but in presence. As her form became unmistakable, she felt less like an assembly of parts, and more like a singular entity, powerful, almost contemplative. Workers often spoke of this feeling in hushed tones during breaks, as though acknowledging it too loudly might disturb the delicate balance of creation. The ship felt aware, somehow, of the hands shaping her, and she responded with a silent dignity that made every completed section feel meaningful. At dusk, when the sun dipped low and the sky turned a deep, quiet ember, the Titanic's structure cast long shadows that stretched across the shipyard in sweeping patterns. Sparks from late shifts formed brief constellations against the darkening sky, rising and dissolving like fleeting stars. The cranes, still in motion, appeared almost graceful as they carried their loads into place beneath the twilight glow. Sometimes, the last workers leaving the yard would stop and look back, letting the silhouette imprint itself in memory. A giant, not yet complete, but already stunning in her immensity. This phase held a sense of transition. The Titanic was no longer a dream, no longer a plan, no longer a skeleton of beams. She had taken form, towering, undeniable, steady. Her presence radiated through the shipyard like a quiet promise, one that all who worked there could feel in the slow rise and fall of their breath at the end of the day. And so the giant continued to grow, shaped by thousands of hands and countless hours, a form capturing not only steel and skill but the spirit of a city that watched her become something extraordinary. As the Titanic rose higher and wider, Belfast began to change in ways that were impossible to ignore. The shipyard no longer felt like a place tucked away at the edge of the city. It had become a quiet focal point, a presence that shaped the rhythm of daily life far beyond the gates of Harland and Wolff. In shops, in narrow alleys, in warm living rooms, illuminated by soft lamplight, the people of Belfast found themselves speaking of the ship with a tone that blended curiosity, pride, and a gentle awe. Even those who had never set foot inside the shipyard felt connected to the enormous shape rising just beyond their streets. From many neighborhoods, the great gantries were visible, their towering arms framing the silhouette of the Titanic as she grew. Children paused during their games to stare at the distant shape, pointing excitedly as they noticed something new, another deck appearing, another section enclosed, another set of scaffolds rising. Their parents watched as well, sometimes with quiet excitement, other times with a soft, contemplative pride, aware that they were witnessing a moment that would echo through generations. The ship was not simply being built in Belfast. The ship was becoming part of Belfast. In the early mornings, when the city was still waking, shopkeepers often found themselves glancing toward the faint outline of the shipyard as they lifted their shutters. The rising hull caught the first light of dawn in a way that made it shimmer subtly against the pale sky. Some said it looked almost ethereal at that hour, as though the ship were emerging from the embrace of fog and sleep. Milkmen delivering bottles along quiet streets paused occasionally, resting their hands on their carts while their eyes drifted toward Queen's Island. They felt, without fully understanding why, that they were watching history take shape. On Sundays, when the shipyard was still, families walked along the riverbanks to glimpse the Titanic from afar. The river carried soft reflections of the ship's dark plates, broken by ripples that shimmered gently in the sunlight. Children skipped stones, sending small circles of movement across the surface, while adults stood in thoughtful silence, taking in the sheer scale of the creation. Some recognized sections they themselves had worked on: plates they had hammered, beams they had lifted, railings they had polished. Others simply admired the sight, knowing that friends or relatives had contributed to the ship, even if their own hands had never touched the steel. In pubs warm with chatter and the faint scent of ale, conversations flowed naturally toward the Titanic. Workers fresh from long shifts described the latest progress with a calm confidence, their voices carrying the steady cadence of people who understood every detail of their craft. Patrons who had no direct connection to the yard listened with interest, nodding slowly as they imagined the immense structure rising piece by piece. The pub lights flickered gently across the faces of men who spoke of beams aligned perfectly, of new decks nearing completion, of the feeling of standing atop the ship and watching Belfast from a height they had never known before. There were evenings when the shipyard itself became a distant glow, illuminated by the last traces of sunlight and the warm radiance of lanterns still burning inside. From across the river, it seemed almost to live, its curved surfaces catching reflections, its scaffolding forming patterns that changed with each passing minute. Couples strolling along the waterfront lingered near the railings, leaning gently against them as they admired the scene. The sound of the water against the stones mixed with distant echoes from the yard, creating a soft, nearly musical harmony that drifted through the cool air. Inside homes across the city, the ship was a quiet presence. Many households had at least one family member who worked in the yard, and each evening brought stories that settled into the rhythm of domestic life. A mother stirring soup might listen as her son described how a new section of deck was installed. A father returning home late might lay his coat across a chair before speaking softly of the long climb to the upper levels, where the wind felt different and the view stretched farther than he had ever seen. These stories became threads that wove the Titanic into the fabric of everyday life. Even for those who had no family ties to the shipyard, the Titanic carried a sense of shared significance. It represented the strength, skill, and spirit of Belfast. It was a symbol of what the city could build, what its people could achieve, and what their labor meant in a world that often overlooked the quiet power of working hands. The ship made Belfast feel larger, more connected to distant places across the sea, more aware of its place in the world. As the Titanic's form neared completion, the city's relationship with her deepened. She had become a presence that people looked for instinctively, almost as if checking on the progress of something they had grown fond of. At dusk, her silhouette stood like a guardian against the sky, calm and assured. At dawn, she appeared softened by the first light, hinting at the possibilities of the day ahead. And through it all, the workers continued to move within the shipyard with steady purpose, aware that the eyes of the city followed their progress. They felt it in the quiet nods exchanged with strangers, in the way conversations paused respectfully when they mentioned their work, in the subtle pride that warmed the air whenever the ship was discussed. Belfast was watching not with impatience or pressure, but with admiration and gratitude. The city and the shipyard had become intertwined, their lives moving in parallel as the Titanic grew into the shape that would one day carry her across the ocean. Every person who watched felt a silent connection to the giant rising at the river's edge, a connection that would remain long after the ship left Belfast's embrace. The day the Titanic finally left the embrace of the shipyard was not marked by thunder or spectacle. It began quietly, with a soft pale light stretching across the Belfast sky and a stillness that carried the weight of anticipation. For months, the ship had grown larger and more defined beneath the watchful eyes of workers and citizens alike, and now she stood ready to lower herself into the water for the very first time. This was not her voyage, not yet only a gentle shift from land to river, from construction cradle to floating life, but the significance of it settled over the city like a cool morning mist. Before most of Belfast stirred awake, the shipyard was already alive with subdued activity. Workers moved with a solemn calm, carrying out final checks with hands that knew every bolt and beam as intimately as their own breath. They walked along the decks, feeling the slight roughness of unfinished railings beneath their gloves, listening to the soft creak of the ship's interior settling into stillness before the great transition. There was a sense of reverence in their movements, as though they were preparing not a machine, but a sleeping giant who would soon take her first quiet step into the world. Lanterns flickered gently inside the hull, their warm light casting soft patterns across steel that had been shaped by thousands of hands. The scent of oil mixed with the faint sweetness of fresh paint, and somewhere deep within the vessel, a final hammer rang out a single echo that felt like the end of a long, steady heartbeat. Outside, the river waited in silence, its smooth surface reflecting the pale morning sky. It seemed to hold its breath, aware that it was about to cradle something immense. As dawn stretched its first rays across the shipyard, people began to gather along the walkways and riverbanks. They arrived quietly without fanfare, families who had come to see the work of husbands, fathers, and sons, children who pressed their small hands against the railings, elderly men who had spent decades building ships and now stood with softened eyes taking in the sight of one that surpassed them all. Conversations were hushed, as though the crowd instinctively understood that this moment required a different kind of silence. Asilinia honored the months of labor, the lessons learned, and the unwavering patience of the workers. The sun climbed slowly, touching the Titanic's hull with the first gentle light of the day. For a moment, the ship seemed to glow, her steel surfaces catching the illumination in soft gradients of gold and silver. Shadows danced along her curves as the light traced every contour, every plate, every rivet. It was as if Belfast itself had stepped back to admire her, offering a quiet moment of recognition between the city and its creation. When the time came for the ship to begin her descent toward the water, the motion was unexpectedly graceful. Slowly, steadily, the supports released their hold. The Titanic eased forward not with force, but with the dignity of something long awaited. The creak of wood and the low groan of shifting weight filled the air, blending with the murmur of the crowd. Workers watched with their hands resting against their tools, their eyes following every inch of the ship's movement. Parents lifted their children so they could see. Even the river seemed to rise slightly, as though reaching out to meet her. The moment the hull touched the water, it felt almost ceremonial. There was no sudden splash, no dramatic upheaval, only a smooth, deliberate merging of steel and river. Ripples expanded outward in gentle circles, carrying reflections across the surface like whispered words. The Titanic floated for the first time, her immense form steady and calm, as if she had always belonged to the water. Soft gasps rose from the crowd, followed by a deep, collective exhale that moved through the shipyard like a breeze. People remained where they stood, watching as the ship settled into her new element. Workers looked at one another with quiet acknowledgement. No loud celebration, only the deep satisfaction that comes from witnessing the culmination of months of effort. They saw not the glamour the world would eventually assign to the Titanic, but the truth of her. The rivets driven by steady hands, the beams lifted through wind and rain, the days spent shaping her frame, the nights spent aligning her heart. She was a vessel born from patience, from skill, from resilience. As the morning stretched onward, the sunlight strengthened, bathing the Titanic in a warm glow. Birds circled above the river, dipping low as though inspecting the newcomer. Children pointed at the tall funnels, imagining how they would look once painted and finished. The workers lingered, unwilling to turn away too quickly, understanding that this was a moment they would remember for years. For many, this was the moment when the ship ceased to be the project, or the whole, and truly became the Titanic, a name, spoken softly with both pride and humility. Slowly, the shipyard began to settle again. The crowd dispersed in calm waves, people walking home with a sense of quiet wonder, tucked gently into their thoughts. The workers returned to their tasks, aware that the ship's launch was only one chapter in a longer story. Much work remained to be done: the interiors, the fittings, the final touches that would transform her from a great floating structure into a vessel ready to cross the ocean. But for now, as the Titanic rested in the sunlight, her hull reflecting the calm water below, there was a sense of completion in the air, an understanding shared by everyone who had witnessed the moment. The ship had left the ground, she had met the water, and in doing so, she had met her destiny, stepping quietly into the next stage of her life with the same grace that carried her through her creation. And now, as the story of the Titanic's birth settles into a quiet hush, you can almost feel the echoes of Belfast softening around the edges. The glow of the shipyard fading into memory, the sparks dissolving into the cool evening air. The great ship rests on the water with a calm presence, as though she herself has surrendered to the slow rhythm of night, drifting gently beneath the pale sky. You might imagine the workers walking home through dim, lantern-lit streets, their steps unhurried as kitchens warm with soft conversation and windows glow against the gathering dusk. In that same slow rhythm, you begin to feel your own breath, ease, your thoughts, loosening like threads pulled free from the weight of the day, until they drift like faint reflections on the surface of the river. As the image of the ship fades into a gentle blurrette's towering hull softened by mist, its scaffolds now empty, and still you allow yourself to rest in that quiet space where nothing presses forward and nothing pulls behind. The calm of Belfast folds itself around you. The river moves with steady patience. The night deepens with a soothing certainty that invites your mind and body to settle. Wrapped in that softness, you drift inward, carried by the same ease with which the Titanic met the water for the first time, floating deeper into the quiet warmth of rest. Sleep comes naturally here, in the hush of this story's end, where the city sleeps, the ship sleeps, and your own thoughts can follow that same gentle, weightless, peaceful until they guide you softly into dreams.